At the first-class lounge of Alex, Gabrielle Union sat quietly, simple yet exuding an undeniable aura. However, a wealthy woman draped in designer brands scoffed and whispered, mockingly believing that Gabrielle did not belong there. But when the plane took off, a shocking moment unfolded. Shaq O'Neal, a basketball legend, billionaire and the epitome of true class, stepped into the first-class cabin. With just one sentence, he left the entire cabin in stunned silence, rendering that woman speechless. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. Do not forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel, so you will not miss more inspiring stories. Los Angeles International Airport. LAX was bustling as ever. The rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases gliding over polished floors, the overhead announcements echoing through the terminals. Together, they compose the familiar soundtrack of travelers rushing to depart or return home. However, inside the first-class lounge, the atmosphere was completely different. It was a world of its own. A luxurious, tranquil space filled with plush leather seats, soft, golden lighting reflecting off expensive wine glasses, and passengers dressed in designer outfits, maintaining a dignified distance from one another. In a quiet corner near the large glass windows, Gabrielle Union sat alone, her legs crossed gracefully, as she focused on a slightly worn paperback book. She wore well-fitted jeans paired with a simple blazer, her hair neatly tied up in a high ponytail. There was no flashy jewelry, no extravagant designer labels, just an effortless confidence that radiated from within. She had nothing to prove. A flight attendant approached her with a polite smile. "Would you like a glass of wine, ma'am?" Gabrielle looked up and returned a gentle smile. "I'll have a cup of green tea, please." "Thank you." Meanwhile, on the other side of the lounge, a completely different presence made an entrance. Margaret Winchester. She shimmered like a beacon of wealth. A perfectly tailored, cream channel dress hugged her figure, paired with sharp Louboutin stilettos. A limited edition navy blue Hermes Kelly bag dangled effortlessly from the crook of her arm. Her wrist sparkled with layers of Cartier, gold and diamond bracelets, while her meticulously manicured fingers flaunted a deep wine red polish, sophisticated and deliberate. Margaret moved with an air of power, her hair styled to perfection, exuding the unmistakable scent of Channel No. 5. Expensive yet slightly overpowering, as if trying too hard to make a statement. Her sharp eyes swept across the lounge, until they landed on Gabrielle. She paused, a smirk formed on her lips, before she turned to the elegantly dressed woman beside her, and then in a voice deliberately louder than necessary, she spoke each word laced with pointed emphasis, ensuring Gabrielle could hear. "Is first class open to just anyone these days? There used to be higher standards here." The air in the lounge seemed to freeze. A few passengers subtly glanced toward Gabrielle, but no one intervened. They simply watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Some took slow sips of their wine, while others scrolled through their phones. Their eyes remained fixated on the unfolding scene. They knew something was about to happen. The atmosphere in the first-class lounge suddenly grew heavy, as if someone had quietly tightened an invisible string. The people sitting nearby shifted slightly, pretending to focus on their phones or newspapers. But their ears were entirely tuned into the conversation unfolding before them. Gabrielle heard every word. Each syllable Margaret spoke was like a polished, razor-sharp blade deliberately aimed at her. But instead of reacting as expected, Gabrielle simply turned another page of her book, her lips maintaining a faint smile. Calm, unshaken, Her indifference became the most powerful counterattack, landing like an invisible slap across Margaret's face. Margaret blinked then tilted her head slightly, tossing her perfectly waved hair back over her shoulder. Her scrutinizing gaze swept over Gabrielle, and an unfamiliar sensation crept into her mind. Discomfort, someone like her accustomed to deference. Admiration and power in every step she took. How could she be ignored so effortlessly? Lowering her voice slightly, though still laced with derision, she remarked, "These days everyone thinks they're a star, no matter how little class they have." It was not just a direct stab at Gabrielle. It was a declaration to the entire lounge that Margaret Winchester was the true embodiment of class. She crossed her legs, striking a perfect posture of elegance. Her wine-red polished fingers twirled the stem of her champagne glass, letting the light refract through the crystal, a silent reminder of her opulence. But what unsettled Margaret most was not Gabrielle's words, it was her lack of response. No furrowed brows, no rolling eyes, no shifting posture, just that same quiet, knowing smile, the kind possessed by those who understood their worth, without needing to flaunt or prove it to anyone. Finally Gabrielle looked up, her gaze calm yet penetrating. For the briefest moment amusement flickered in her eyes, as if she were watching a familiar game, one she had mastered long ago. And then silence, not the silence of weakness, but the kind sharper than any retort. Margaret felt the discomfort deepen. Gabrielle's confidence did not come from a Hermes bag, or a Chanel dress. It did not rely on diamonds, or an overpriced glass of champagne. It radiated from within her, from the way she carried herself with effortless grace, from her quiet, unshakable pride. Most of all, from the fact that no venomous words could rattle her. Margaret pressed her lips together, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, a fleeting glimpse of uncertainty flashing through them, gone in an instant. Then she let out a small laugh. But this time, it lacked the confidence and authority it once held. Because for the first time in her life, Margaret Winchester realized she was no longer the one in control of the game. Margaret let out a soft chuckle, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of dissatisfaction. Despite her best efforts to undermine Gabrielle with sharp words, all she received in return was an unshakable composure. And that was precisely what Margaret despised the most. The indifference of those she deemed unworthy of being on the same level as herself. She rose to her feet, draping her Burberry coat over her shoulders with effortless elegance. With a powerful stride, she made her way to the first-class check-in counter, deliberately positioning herself just close enough to stand directly behind Gabrielle. In line. And then, the moment Margaret had been waiting for arrived. As Gabrielle pulled out her first-class ticket, Margaret feigned surprise, her eyes widening, as if she had just witnessed something utterly unthinkable. "Oh, first class, how interesting. I remember a time when people actually dressed appropriately for flights." Her voice was not particularly loud, but it carried just enough volume to be heard by those nearby. As she spoke, she lightly ran her fingers over the luxurious tweed fabric of her Chanel jacket, as if silently reminding herself and everyone else of her own superiority. A few people in line cast a fleeting glance at Gabrielle before quickly looking away. Others stifled quiet chuckles, amused by the subtle, yet pointed confrontation unfolding before them. Gabrielle, still calm, looked up and offered a soft smile, a smile that was both serene and laced with an almost imperceptible sharpness. "Oh, is that so? Well, I prefer comfort," I always thought planes were for flying, not for fashion shows. Her response was succinct yet piercing. A direct blow to Margaret's pretentious remark, yet delivered with such effortless grace that it carried not a hint of malice. It was spoken as if Gabrielle was merely sharing an offhand thought, rather than dismantling the very mindset of the woman. Standing behind her, a few passengers chuckled, but this time the laughter was not at Gabrielle. It was because of her. Margaret froze for a brief moment. She had not expected her remark to be so deftly deflected, dismissed with such poised, cutting precision. Annoyance curled within her. But as someone well versed in high society gatherings and the art of veiled insults, Margaret knew now was not the time to reveal her irritation. She straightened her posture, mustered a refined smile, and silently boarded the plane. But in her mind she was already strategizing. Because if there was one thing Margaret Winchester would never accept, it was being put in her place, especially by those she considered beneath her. Margaret stepped into the first-class cabin with her usual air of confidence, walking slowly, deliberately, as if each stride she took carried more worth than anyone else's in this section. As the flight attendant greeted her with a bow and led her to her seat, Margaret maintained a satisfied smile. To her, first class was not just a ticket. It was a symbol of superiority, a pass into the world of those who were truly deserving. But then, the moment her eyes landed on the seat in front of her, that satisfaction vanished. She froze. Her seat was directly across from Gabrielle. The realization hit Margaret's pride like a slap. It was a cruel reminder that, no matter how hard she tried, she could never truly escape Gabrielle's presence. The woman she believed did not belong here. A flicker of unease passed over Margaret's face, but she quickly masked it with a condescending smirk. Adjusting her Hermes silk scarf, she drawled in a syrupy sweet tone, "Oh, darling, you must be in the wrong seat. Economy's in the back." The words fell into the space between them, like a drop of ink in a clear glass of water. Each syllable deliberate, not loud, but just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. The air in the cabin grew heavier in an instant. A man reading a newspaper lowered it slightly. His eyes never left the scene unfolding before him. A young woman pretended to adjust the volume on her headphones, but the curiosity on her face was undeniable. They were not the type to interfere, but who would pass up the chance to witness a perfectly staged social duel right before their eyes? Meanwhile, Gabrielle merely looked at Margaret for a brief second before reclining into her seat with effortless ease, exuding an air of complete indifference. She did not rush to respond. She did not frown, did not bristle. She simply let Margaret struggle in her attempt to diminish her after a few beats of silence. Gabrielle tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering in her gaze, her lips curling, as if she had just heard an entertaining joke. "Oh, is that so?" Her voice was light, almost casual, but every word carried an unmistakable weight. "Funny, I was under the impression that my seat was printed on my ticket." Then she slowly pulled out her boarding pass, turning it just enough for the bold, unmistakable first-class seat number to be clearly visible before Margaret's eyes. A few passengers stifled quiet chuckles. They saw exactly what was happening. The elegance yet sharp mockery in Gabrielle's response left Margaret momentarily speechless. She knew that if she pushed this further, it would only backfire on her. So she let out a soft chuckle, but it no longer carried the confidence it had before. She lowered herself into her seat, but her glare remained fixed on Gabrielle. because outwardly Margaret might have conceded, but deep inside, Margaret Winchester never accepted defeat so easily. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin still carried the lingering tension of a silent standoff. Some passengers tried to feign indifference, but their eyes subtly flicked toward Gabrielle and Margaret, waiting to see if the confrontation would continue. Margaret sat upright, legs crossed, hands resting on her Hermes bag, like an invisible shield. Yet her eyes constantly darted toward Gabrielle. She was not ready to accept silent defeat, but before she could devise a way to regain control of this power play, an unexpected event shattered the entire dynamic. The first-class cabin door swung open. A towering figure stepped inside. He was so tall that he had to duck slightly to pass through the airplane door. Shaquille O'Neal, no introduction was needed, but his presence sent an immediate shock wave through the cabin. A few passengers halted their conversations. Some widened their eyes in surprise, and a young boy in the back gasped, "Mom." "That's Shaq." Shaquille walked in, making no effort to draw attention. Yet his sheer presence did it for him. He was not dressed in an expensive suit or anything that screamed wealth. He wore an oversized hoodie, loose Nike sweatpants, and a pair of massive sneakers. Simple yet carrying an undeniable aura. The entire first-class cabin seemed to shift with every step he took, a symbol of power and success, yet without the need to flaunt it. Margaret could not hide her shock. Shaq scanned the cabin, then suddenly stopped when he spotted Gabrielle. For a brief moment his face lit up with a genuine, radiant smile, then he let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed through the space. "Yo, Gabby, I did not expect to see you here." Gabrielle, who had been reclining in her seat with effortless poise, burst into laughter at the sight of her old friend. She stood up, stepped toward Shaq, and fist bumped him with a natural ease. An unspoken camaraderie between longtime friends, needing no performance yet overflowing with connection. The scene unfolding before Margaret was like a splash of cold water to the face. The pieces began to click into place in her mind, and suddenly she realized she had just spent the past hour trying to humiliate one of the most respected and beloved actresses in Hollywood. And now standing before her was Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball legend, a billionaire entrepreneur, one of the most powerful figures in the sports world. Yet he was dressed even more casually than Gabrielle. Margaret felt her stomach sink. All the mocking remarks about dressing appropriately and not belonging in first class suddenly felt laughably irrelevant in the presence of those who had achieved true success without ever needing to prove anything. She clutched the handle of her purse tighter, as if trying to anchor herself to something familiar, something that could steady her. A strange silence settled over the cabin. Some passengers stole glances at Margaret. A few smirked at the irony of the situation. And then Shaq turned his gaze, warm yet piercing, locking directly onto Margaret. She knew at that moment her most uncomfortable reckoning was about to begin. The suffocating silence engulfed the first-class cabin. Margaret sat motionless, her hands lightly gripping the handle of her Hermes bag. But the sense of power she once held was slowly slipping away. Shaquille O'Neal stood there, towering and steady like an unshakable fortress. Dressed in nothing more than a hoodie and sweatpants, he still commanded absolute presence. His natural confidence and the aura of a man who had conquered the worlds of sports, business, and entertainment made him the undeniable focal point of the cabin. He looked directly at Margaret, not with anger, not with mockery, but with a piercing, authoritative gaze. It was the look of a man who had seen and understood many people in this world. And then in a deep yet unwavering voice, Shaq spoke, "I happen to hear you talking about first-class standards." A brief pause. No one laughed. No one seemed impatient. Everyone was waiting. "That's interesting," he continued. "Because to me, real class is not about clothes or a plane ticket." Each word landed like a heavyweight punch, leaving Margaret at a complete loss for words. Her confidence crumbled. She could feel all eyes on her. Not with the usual reverence she was accustomed to, but with scrutiny, evaluation. Margaret had always been the one defining standards, believing herself to be the authority on luxury and class, but now one of the most successful men on the planet. A man known not only for his wealth, but for his generosity and humility, was dismantling her entire belief system. With a single sentence, that familiar sense of control vanished. Her voice, usually so composed, faltered. Nearly trembling, "I just thought." Gabrielle's gaze met Margaret's. Sharp yet gentle. There was no gloating, no satisfaction of having won. Only understanding laced with a hint of disappointment. An expression Margaret had never been on the receiving end of before. Gabrielle slowly tilted her head. Her voice was not loud, was not harsh, but it struck at the core of Margaret's deepest fear. "You can buy a first-class ticket." She paused for just a second, letting the words sink into the heavy silence. Then in an even calmer yet undeniably weighty tone, she added, "But you cannot buy class." Silence filled the space. No more whispers. No more judgmental glances. Only the steady hum of the airplane's engines, and the weight of an undeniable truth pressing down on the cabin. A few passengers exchanged quiet glances, but no one spoke. There was no need, because the most important lesson had already been delivered flawlessly. Margaret felt her face burning. She could not look at anyone, could not find the words to argue, because how could she possibly fight against a truth that could not be denied? The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had never been this heavy. Margaret Winchester, a woman who had always walked with the pride of a queen, now sat in complete silence, motionless as if stripped of the arrogant armor she had worn for so many years. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her champagne glass, a gesture that should have been elegant, but instead unconsciously reflected the turmoil raging within her. She took a sip, but the rich taste of French wine no longer registered on her tongue, because every single thought in her mind was consumed by what had just happened. Who had Margaret just insulted? A Gabrielle Union, an actress, Hollywood actress, a woman admired not only for her talent, but for her grace, humility, and unwavering strength. A Shaquille O'Neal basketball legend, billionaire philanthropist, a man so powerful that no one dared to question his greatness, yet so grounded and humble that all the extravagance around him felt meaningless. Margaret could not believe it. How had she managed to push herself into this situation? She was used to being the most influential voice in any room, but this time she was the one being judged. The feeling of being completely exposed. She could sense the eyes around her, not overt but brimming with silent understanding. The passengers who had remained quiet, while she threw subtle jabs at Gabrielle, were now exchanging knowing glances, nodding ever so slightly, as if confirming an unspoken truth among themselves. No one said a word, but they all understood. They understood that Margaret had just been placed in the very position she had tried to impose on others. They understood that true class had nothing to do with the numbers in a bank account, but everything to do with a person's character. And most importantly, they understood that the only loser in the first-class cabin today was not Gabrielle, not Shaq. It was Margaret Winchester. Margaret pressed her lips together, but she could not argue. She wanted to say something. A justification, a defense. Some feeble attempt to salvage the last shreds of her dignity. But she could not, because how could she argue against the truth? How could she refute a lesson that had been made so painfully clear? Her grip tightened around the champagne glass again. But this time, the trembling in her hands no longer came from anger. It came from the realization that she was wrong. Wrong beyond redemption, wrong in front of the very people she once deemed beneath her. Wrong in a way that everyone around her had just witnessed. She swallowed hard, but the once sweet taste of champagne had turned unbearably bitter. The silence in the first-class cabin lasted only a few seconds, but it felt as heavy as if it had stretched on for minutes. Then, as if to put an end to the lingering tension, once and for all, Shaquille O'Neal slowly stood up. As he stretched gently, the cabin seemed to shrink around his towering presence. A perfect contrast to his measured, calm demeanor, completely devoid of any attempt to overpower anyone. But even without trying, he commanded attention. His gaze swept across the cabin, slow and deliberate, taking in everyone, before finally settling on Margaret Winchester. She sat rigidly, refusing to meet his eyes. But Shaq had no intention of humiliating her further. Instead, his voice resonated deep, warm but firm, like a final affirmation. Funny how some people judge others just by what they wear. A brief pause. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. I may dress simply, but that does not change who I am. Shaq's words reached everyone in the cabin. Not just Margaret. It was not a reprimand. It was not an attack. It was a lesson. Subtle yet undeniable. He smiled, a proud yet gentle smile, then turned to Gabrielle. Margaret felt the world shift around her in that moment. Her entire perception was shaken. Her whole life she had believed that social status was built on extravagance, on draping oneself in luxury brands, appearing in the most exclusive places, and maintaining distance from those she deemed unworthy. But now standing before her were two people more famous, wealthier, and more powerful than she could ever dream to be, who needed none of those things to prove it. No Hermes bags, no dazzling diamonds, no impeccably tailored designer suits or gowns. Just confidence, presence, and the way they treated others. And the most painful realization of all, Margaret was the only one in this first-class cabin being judged. The atmosphere shifted. Margaret was no longer the center. Shaq still stood there, but his presence was no longer just about handling Margaret. He was conveying something bigger. Passengers nodded subtly, some offering small smiles, not out of satisfaction at Margaret's embarrassment, but because they had just witnessed something rare. A moment where a person of immense wealth, success, and humility had taught another a lesson they had perhaps never heard before. Shaq slowly took his seat, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Gabrielle, with a soft yet knowing smile, spoke one last time. There was no need to make Margaret feel worse. But this lesson could not simply pass as a fleeting moment. She tilted her head slightly toward Margaret, her gaze no longer sharp, but holding an almost curious understanding, gentle yet piercing. True class is not about what you wear, Margaret's heart clenched. It's about how you treat those you think are beneath you. This time no one laughed. No one saw this as a power play anymore. This was no longer just an exchange between two women. This was an undeniable truth. And every single person in that first-class cabin had just witnessed it. Margaret had no way out, but she remained silent. She could not argue, she could not say anything, without making herself look even smaller. Because now, any word she spoke would only make things worse. She simply lowered her head, pretending to busy herself with her champagne, only to realize it had never tasted more bland. She felt small in a world she once thought she ruled. And that was the greatest shock of Margaret Winchester's life. Margaret Winchester, who had once wielded absolute power, in every conversation now sat in silence, feeling as if the entire world around her had shifted. She had never experienced this feeling before. The feeling of not being the center. The feeling of being seen through. The feeling of having nothing to hold on to except raw, unfiltered shame. The champagne glass in her hand was empty. Yet nothing could dull the overwhelming sense of humiliation filling her chest. She wanted to escape, to find a place where she could regain control. But she was trapped, pinned beneath the weight of knowing glances. And she knew there was no way out, except to face the truth. Margaret's face flushed red as she finally spoke. For the first time on this flight, her voice held no arrogance, no sarcasm, no control. It was smaller than usual, slightly unsteady, but she clung to the last remnants of composure she had left. I sincerely apologize. I did not realize who you were. Gabrielle did not look surprised, but she did not accept the apology easily either. She studied Margaret for a long moment, as if measuring the sincerity behind those words. A brief silence, then Gabrielle smiled slightly. But it was not a smile of concession, nor was it the smile of someone relishing a victory. It was the smile of someone who understood the true weight of an apology. She tilted her head slightly, her voice soft yet sharp, unmistakably clear. The problem is not that you did not recognize me. The problem is how you treat people you think are beneath you. There was no venom in her words, but their weight was undeniable. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly, but this time not out of anger, because she knew Gabrielle was right. There was no way to argue, no way to escape the truth. And Margaret Winchester had never been forced to face the truth quite like this before. Shaq watched quietly, but his eyes said everything. Shaquille O'Neal did not speak, yet his gaze remained gentle, understanding there was no need to add anything further, because the lesson was already clear. He knew Margaret had just endured one of the most uncomfortable moments of her life. But sometimes the most important lessons come from moments like these. Gabrielle understood that too, which was why she did not push Margaret into further humiliation. Because she knew that sometimes silence and realization were more powerful than mockery or scorn. Margaret lowered her head for the first time. No longer the one in control. She took a deep breath, then slowly nodded, as if finally understanding something. This was not an apology meant to smooth over the situation. For the first time in a long time, she felt the real weight of her actions. No excuses, no justifications. Just a belated acknowledgement that she had been wrong. And that was the first step toward change. Outside the window, the city lights began to emerge under the night sky. As the plane slowly descended, the tension from earlier had eased. but the echoes of what had just happened still lingered, like a thin layer of mist, quietly settling over the first-class cabin. Margaret Winchester had not said another word. Since Gabrielle had given her final answer, she sat still, her gaze no longer scrutinizing others with sharp judgment. Instead, it had become unusually quiet. No more arrogance, no more sarcasm. Only the silence of someone slowly coming to terms with reality. As the plane descended further, the flight attendant announced for passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Gabrielle leisurely folded her book, her gaze drifting out the window, her lips maintaining a calm, knowing smile. Shaq stretched slightly, then turned to look at Gabrielle, with a mix of pride and amusement in his eyes. "You handled that smoothly," he said with a warm yet mischievous chuckle. Gabrielle laughed but only shook her head lightly. "I did not do anything. She just had to face the truth on her own." Shaq nodded, his eyes flickering briefly toward Margaret, before turning away. There was nothing more to be said. Everything was already clear. A soft bump echoed as the plane touched down, followed by the subtle sensation of the wheels rolling along the runway. Some passengers began to stir. Seatbelt clicks whispered exchanges. The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "We have arrived safely, please remain seated until the plane has come to a complete stop." As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers started standing up, reaching for their overhead luggage. A few rows ahead, an elderly woman struggled to pull her suitcase down. Her frail arms lacked the strength. Without waiting for anyone to ask, Shaq stepped forward effortlessly. With just one hand, he lifted the suitcase down and placed it neatly in front of her. The elderly woman smiled gratefully, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. "You are?" Shaq gave her a warm, easygoing smile, his voice deep but gentle. "Just someone with longer arms than you, ma'am." The entire first-class cabin let out a soft chuckle at his humor, but beneath it everyone recognized one thing. This was true class, not the expensive clothes, not the designer brands, but the way a person treated others. A few rows away, Margaret saw everything unfold. But this time she did not judge. She watched Shaq, observed how he helped without being asked. She saw how Gabrielle greeted those who approached her, with sincerity without a trace of pretense. And she realized that everything she had believed in for so long had been wrong. She had spent her entire life building the image of a powerful woman, thinking that status came from what she owned. But she had never once considered, true class is not about what you possess. It's about how you make others feel in your presence. Margaret lowered her gaze. For the first time during this entire flight, she felt small, in a way she had never experienced before. Passengers murmured quietly as they disembarked. A woman in a simple yet elegant business dress turned to the person beside her, her tone laced with meaning. "Funny, is not it?" One person tried so hard to prove they were above everyone else, while these two superstars acted like the most ordinary people here. Margaret heard every word, but she did not react. No anger, no defiance, only a contemplative silence. As the plane came to a full stop, and passengers began exiting, Margaret did not push forward as she usually would. Instead, she rose slowly, bowed her head slightly, and walked off the plane in silence, without a trace of arrogance left on her face. She had lost what she once thought defined class, but perhaps for the first time, she was stepping forward, with a newfound understanding of the world around her. Margaret stepped off the plane in silence, But the incident that had just unfolded still lingered in her mind. Los Angeles International Airport was bustling and chaotic. People moving with rolling suitcases. The constant announcements echoing through the terminals. Yet even as she walked among a crowd of strangers, Margaret had never felt more lost. It was not because she had lost her familiar air of authority, but because for the first time in her life, she realized that the things she once held most dear no longer meant anything. She was still draped in the most luxurious brands, but never before had she felt so empty. No one looked at Margaret with admiration anymore. No one gasped at her wealth. No one cared about the name Margaret Winchester anymore. What they remembered was the lesson that Gabrielle and Shaq had taught. In first class, no one spoke loudly, but no one forgot a passenger. A young woman with a sharp, short haircut quietly picked up her phone, opened a social media app, and began typing a few words laced with meaning. You can buy a first-class ticket, but you cannot buy class. She paused for a moment, as if still reflecting on what she had just witnessed, then added another line. And sometimes the person you think is unworthy is the one the whole world truly admires. Along with the words, she uploaded a candid photo of Shaquille O'Neal helping an elderly passenger retrieve their luggage, and Gabrielle Union chatting warmly with the flight crew. Two major stars, yet there was no distance between them and anyone else. Two people who truly embodied class, not because they were famous, but because they treated everyone with the utmost sincerity and respect. The young woman set her phone down, but within minutes, the likes and shares began pouring in. The story had left the confines of that first-class cabin, and it was not stopping there. Margaret sat in the baggage claim area. Her heart still heavy, she pulled out her phone, intending to check her emails out of habit, but instead a post appeared right at the top of her social media feed. That post, those words cut into her pride like a knife. She read them over and over again, then slowly scrolled down to the comments. Hundreds, then thousands of people had expressed their agreement. Shaq has always been a legend, not just in sports but in the way he treats people. Gabrielle Union is the perfect example of grace and strength. Growing up in a middle-class family does not mean she's undeserving of anything. Some people are too busy flaunting their status to realize that truly great people never have to. You can buy a first-class ticket, but you cannot buy dignity. Margaret swallowed hard. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew there was nothing she could say to change what had happened. Nothing could erase the humiliation she felt. She had been exposed not physically, but in the rawest sense of who she really was. Suddenly, the Hermes bag in her hand felt unbearably heavy. Not as a symbol of power but as a burden. She no longer felt the urge to put on a show. No one cared about Margaret Winchester anymore. No one was waiting to see what she wore, what she carried, or where she was going. Because in that moment she was just another person who had learned a lesson far greater than she ever expected. A lesson she should have understood long ago. She took a deep breath and turned off her phone. As Gabrielle and Shaq left the airport, they had no idea that this story was beginning to explode across social media. News outlets, articles about celebrity behavior, discussions about what true class really meant. It all started from a single first-class cabin on an ordinary flight. But this was not just about a confrontation between two people. It became a reminder to millions of others about kindness, about character, about the fact that real class cannot be bought And no matter how much Margaret Winchester wished she could forget this, the world would not let it be forgotten. Gabrielle and Shaq stepped out of customs, blending into the bustling airport crowd. Yet they were not swallowed by it. Despite being two world-class stars, there were no bodyguards, no flashy displays, and none of the usual deference people often showed the ultra-wealthy. They were simply two individuals, moving through the world with ease and composure. Shaq folded his arms, and glanced at Gabrielle before bursting into laughter. I was just planning to take a nap, but I ended up watching a full-on drama series on the plane. His deep, booming laughter echoed through the airport terminal, drawing a few curious glances. Gabrielle chuckled too, her voice amused but unsurprised. "Welcome to first-class flights, Shaq." She shook her head, adjusting the strap of her simple handbag, then shot him a playful look. "This is exactly why I prefer reading a book over getting caught up in real-life drama." Shaq laughed again. "Oh, come on, sis. A little drama makes life more memorable." Gabrielle shrugged, her smile unwavering. But there was a deeper glimmer in her eyes, a quiet contemplation of what had just transpired. "Yeah, memorable, not just for us." Shaq gave a knowing nod. He understood exactly what she meant. What started as a first-class flight had become something much bigger than a routine trip. It turned into a powerful lesson about how people treat one another. A woman who believed that wealth and status defined class had been proven wrong in front of an entire cabin of passengers. A basketball legend, a man who could have anything he wanted, had no need for extravagant displays to establish his worth. A famous actress, someone who could easily immerse herself in the glamorous world, chose instead to walk through life with quiet confidence, unshaken and unbothered. And now thousands, perhaps millions, reading this story on social media, might be asking themselves, have I ever judged someone based on appearances alone? Am I trying to showcase wealth rather than true character? Do I really understand what genuine class means? Somewhere in a quieter corner of the airport, Margaret Winchester stood motionless, next to the baggage carousel. She no longer radiated the dazzling confidence she had at the start. Gone was the smug smile. Gone was the defiant arch of her brow. All that remained was a woman, seeing the world differently. For the first time, she unlocked her phone, scrolling through the viral post, thousands of comments discussing the lesson from the flight. She knew now that her arrogance had been stripped bare before the world, and yet she did not feel anger. Only emptiness and perhaps a hint of regret. Regret for taking so long to understand. She took a deep breath and quietly walked away, no longer concerned with impressing anyone. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward real change. Shaq and Gabrielle stepped outside the airport, the warm afternoon sun casting a golden glow on their relaxed faces. Nothing had changed. They were still themselves. Still people who had nothing to prove to anyone. But for everyone who had witnessed or heard about this story, one thing had changed forever. They would never see class the same way again. Because class is not about the first-class ticket in your hand. It's about how you treat people when no one is watching. So while this first-class flight had landed, the lesson about true class would linger on. Shaquille O'Neal and Gabrielle Union had no need to flaunt their wealth, because they understood that a person's value is not measured by what they own, but by how they treat others. As for Margaret Winchester, once the self-proclaimed queen of luxury, She had learned a harsh truth. Money can buy a first-class seat, but it cannot buy respect. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful content. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.